Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
So there you go, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. I'm your host, and today I want to talk about sovereignty and where it's vested, but probably not in exactly the same way I've done it before. Part of the reason I wanted to do this show is that I had some rulings, some court rulings that somebody had provided me. I was reading through, and among the rulings was a case where a native company was in a legal dispute anyway, and the long and the short of it is a judge was making a ruling of whether that native company could be protected by quote unquote tribal sovereignty, and the inference was whether the nation had extended its sovereignty to the company. And the problem with that is completely backwards from a native perspective. So part of what I've got to do here is I've got to talk a little bit about governmental systems where sovereignty is vested in them. In a monarchy, for instance, the monarch, the king, the queen, whatever, they are the sovereign. I mean, and that is where sovereignty is vested in that system. And of course, it's based on one of the biggest lies ever told, that somehow these royal families were bestowed this power by God himself or the church. So that's where sovereignty is vested in a monarchy. In a democracy, one of the things that where a democracy is different than a republic. In a democracy, the sovereignty is still vested in the mass, in the people en masse, so to speak. So it's the will of the people that is supposed to be where sovereignty is vested, but not in the individual. That's the difference with a republic. In a republic, the sovereignty is vested with the individual. And so when a government asserts sovereignty, it is given that authority by the people. So it's all a little bit different. Now, the biggest difference with most native governments, and I don't want to necessarily call them flat out anarchists, but there's a version of what I would call, or what we're going to call, indigenous anarchy, where what makes it somewhat of anarchist, I guess, is the lack of hierarchy. And because there's a lot of different, I've heard people define anarchy different ways, and we're not talking about chaos here. We're talking about a lack of hierarchy, and that could not be more clear from a Haudenosaunee standpoint. That part of our system was based on a full acknowledgement of that lack of hierarchy. Chiefs, Rodianesu, they don't have authority. The only authority that they can display is what people give them, and it's not like a transference of sovereignty from the people to a chief or to a clan mother or to it's none of that. They are really the voices of the people. They help gather the minds of the people, but they aren't the leaders in the way that any place else would define that. And of course, if you look at anarchy from Jake and I were talking before the show, from a libertarian standpoint or from even a European model, a lot of times anarchy is reactionary. It's like a rebellion against power, and it's about individuals trying to seize power unto themselves, almost like I am a king. We all are kings, kind of thing. And that's different than what the native perspective. The native perspective is all about a lack of hierarchy, and it's more organic. So having said that, listening to a judge make a ruling based on this notion that, well, we can't acknowledge that you are protected by your quote unquote tribal sovereignty unless your tribe, unless your nation, has extended that sovereignty to you. That's problematic. And it's frankly wrong. It is literally a judge trying to judge Native people through his own lens, which simply doesn't work. And of course it does get confusing because our own people fall into that trap. Tribal councils, frankly, traditional and elected councils, they get caught into this whole idea that they are the authority. I've listened to men who claim to be chiefs saying, I'm the only one with this authority. Based on what? I mean, certainly not based on the Guyana-Goa. And look, and I'm not trying to speak for all Native people. Most of what I'm talking about is from a Haudenosaunee perspective. But I know a lot of when I have had these conversations with other Ungwe from other territories, when we cut through all of the whole hereditary chief, some of this language that gets associated with Native people, they say, well, that's true. We're not really like that either. So, I mean, I got to come back to this notion that our system is different. Our systems have always been different, and that's why, when people talk about, even today, when we talk about things like public finance and that kind of stuff, we don't tax our people. There is no government authority to impose. We don't really have laws in our territory. Well, there's resolutions that come from quote unquote tribal councils, but we don't have this whole book of statutes and penal codes and all that other stuff. Unfortunately, too many places default completely to state law or federal law, and that causes confusion. We also, when we talk about whether the nation has extended its sovereignty to an individual, the part that's crazy about that is many of these quote unquote federally recognized tribes, they're getting more of their authority from the federal government through this recognition and acknowledgement process than they are through their own people and through their own, whether they have a written constitution or operate through some sort of traditional based constitution like the Guyana-Goa. And so we depart from that stuff and we keep defaulting to the authority that the federal government is granted. I mean, look, there are some territories where the federal government has determined leadership, especially when there was like a conflict. We saw this in Oneida. We've seen it play out in Cayuga. And we play into that. We start, participating in this contest in front of the Interior Department or the Bureau of Indian Affairs to determine who the lead, to see who can win the contest. Rather than us really taking it upon ourselves and solving the problem internally. And I understand the conflicts with that and the difficulties in some of that. But see, we get caught into this whole thing. So then we have these governments that, because the federal government is going to grant certain authorities to these governments, we start to believe that these governments have authority over us, even if our traditional system or our written constitutions say, no, you don't. I mean, one of the things that was kind of interesting about the Seneca Nation is their constitution is only a few pages long. I mean, I got one of these little handbooks somewhere around here with the Seneca Constitution, and even in a 4-inch handbook, the thing is only a couple of dozen pages long. I mean, so you only got like a paragraph or two written on each page. So they're not complicated, and there is not a whole lot of transferences of authority. There's responsibilities that are laid out there for council and various positions that are in there, but it's also rife with all kinds of stuff like state law and religion and all kinds of other stuff that there's no call for that even being in there. But so there's lots of confusion. We find many of our territories believe that if they act like the state government or if they act like the federal government, that somehow they will be acting more like a sovereign. And so they do things like stamping cigarettes or granting licenses or putting these other regulatory systems in place that we could argue whether they even have the authority to do that. And we're going to see some of the stuff play out here with this whole marijuana thing now. New York State just passed a legalized recreational marijuana, and they're going to have all kinds of strict regulations. The question is, does the state's strict regulations on marijuana, does it really apply on native territory? We sure as hell don't let their tobacco regs apply to us here. So this is going to get confusing. And again, the authority, not just the responsibility, but the authority of nation government, so whether you're talking about Seneca Nation or any place else, this is going to be a complex issue. And we know how the courts are going to rule. The courts are going to treat the Seneca Nation or any nation just like they view their own governments, hierarchical, where the power is vested. They aren't going to make that distinction and understand, okay, I see, Native people's sovereignty is vested with the individual. So the nation can only wield authority if the people explicitly, not implicitly, but explicitly give them that authority. See, this is what's very difficult. And of course, then when we start talking about things like businesses, well, if you have a business on a native territory, how is that business structured or incorporated? Is it just a DBA, which is essentially doing business as? Many native territories, or many native businesses, in at least in the territories that are affected by New York State, we are almost forced to be DBAs, again, doing business as, because there you're just an individual who is conducting business as such and such, as a given name. And the reason for that is because we don't have corporate charters on our territories. Most of us don't. And if we incorporate as a state corporation, or even as a corporation, say like a Delaware Corp or whatever, there's some states that the incorporation laws are easy. So that's where many companies will find, well, which state has the most lax incorporation laws? Well, if we do that, then we're no longer the individual where that sovereignty again is vested. So, I think back here, the New York State would view a corporation as taxable, even if they know that we as individuals are not. So there is this give and take, and there's this risk involved in how you set up your business as a native person. So most of the time we have to basically just do business, be an individual doing business as a name we made up. So that name of the company isn't really a company, or in the corporation sense of the word. It's just you doing business as that company. And so, I'm saying all this because there's a logic to why business is done the way it's done. Because once we become a corporation, and there's some workarounds there. Many native territories started using Sac and Fox incorporation laws, because while New York State or some of these states could not stop a Sac and Fox corporation from operating within the state, they didn't have the jurisdiction over it. And see, that's where a lot of this comes back to is things like jurisdictional issues. So, which kind of is a long way of getting back to where the conversation started, where a judge is, in a state court or in a federal court, is making a determination about how business is conducted on a territory, whether the sovereignty that is or isn't quite fully acknowledged by the courts, whether that sovereignty, in whatever limited capacity they can acknowledge it, extends down to an operating business. It's confusing, but I wanted to at least have the conversation, because when I start seeing rulings like, and this is recent ruling, it concerns me, because we have to do a better job. And look, I have to fault many of the nations, the tribal councils or the traditional councils, because they just add to the confusion. There is no reason in the world why a nation can't say, look, you don't understand, our system is different. For us, we aren't the ultimate sovereign as an elected council or a traditional council. That's not the way our system works. Our system works on a basis of avoiding the power dynamic associated with hierarchies. And if the so-called leadership or the federally recognized leaders of a territory would come out and say that, I mean, look, we also know that because of the way elections take place on native territories, we don't vote much. And of course, I don't vote at all, and I don't advocate voting because the system is flawed. I mean, when I look at some of these native territories that have these elections, sometimes you're talking about hundreds of people that are determining the quote unquote federally recognized leadership, whether it's Canada or the U.S. side, for thousands of people is being determined by a handful because we don't trust the system. And we know that if we don't participate in the government as it is being prescribed in this manner, then we aren't legitimately giving that authority to those individuals. But see, that's not the way the United States works. The United States, everything's a contest, right? Everything's about pay to play and everything else. So we get into this struggle. And, oftentimes I refer to this as part of the identity struggle that we have. Because who are we? Are we the people that we are we still living in some manner as the people we always have been for thousands of years? Or because of colonization, have we restructured our very identity to emulate our oppressors in the first place? Are we looking at our territories as this hierarchy of power? Look, I understand we can see hierarchies in salaries or in affluence, but do we have to associate the same kind of hierarchy with governing authority? See, and I argue that we don't. And I'm not saying this to be disrespectful of any given nation. Look, one of the things that most drew me and that I was most attracted to living and raising my family here in Seneca Territory was the fact that the Seneca Nation government wasn't omnipresent, that it didn't try to dictate every aspect of life. It was, to me, it operated, for all of its flaws, it still operated in a way that it had certain administrative responsibilities. It wasn't the iron-fisted ruler of the territory. And look, there were some debates, that went on about how much they could, limit business. But part of that is even gets driven by the lack of education that our own people have about, again, what sovereignty means. Look, I've heard some people in many Native communities just say, "Oh yeah, those dirty business, those greedy businessmen, they're just exploiting our sovereignty. They're using it just for themselves." And it's like, you don't quite understand what the concept means then. Yeah, as Native people, we do need to exploit our regulatory advantages. And when I say exploit, I don't mean exploit it and take it away. I mean, use it. Because if you're viewing your sovereignty as something that, and I've heard the analogy, so well, we need to preserve our sovereignty. What does that mean? Put it in a jar, put a layer of wax on it, put it on a shelf, and never test it? No, to be sovereign is to use your sovereignty. And I'm not saying that just a few people should be able to do it. And unfortunately, what happens is, even when there's animosity between the business community and the governing authority, and then maybe the third party in this love triangle are the people, you end up creating a few business people because you become so anti-business that you're not going to stop the ones that exist. So that door gets slammed shut. So now you only have a few people making a lot of money in a given territory. I'm not saying that's the way it is in every territory, but. So rather than saying, look, everybody should have an opportunity to utilize the advantages that come with our sovereignty, it doesn't always play out that well. You have the nation governments that try to they use it when it's convenient, but then they bow down to the state or the federal government when it becomes somewhat contested. So. And that diminishes what we all view as sovereign. And look, a perfect example is, why the hell does a Seneca Nation elected official allow the federal government to claim tax revenue from their income generated working for the nation? And working for the nation as a part of the nation. You are an individual who's Seneca. You live on Seneca territory. You work for your Seneca Nation government, and you got to give up 25% of your salary to the federal government? See, and it wasn't always that way. But when the nation did that, the sovereignty becomes diminished only because of the presumption. Well, look, if the nation is paying, if all these nation officials are paying income tax, then everybody has to, even though there's really no grounds for that. I mean, look, I'm not talking about whether the IRS claims they have grounds. It's whether we've ever given them grounds. And on that fateful day that then a non-native controller for the Seneca Nation decided that he needed to start filing federal income tax back when people were barely making any money anyway. On that fateful day, it changed things. So this is the problem. I mean, so where is the tail wagging the dog? And of course, when you get into gaming, that's where you start getting into this classic idea of the tail wagging the dog. Now be the success of a casino, the revenue generated for it, and what you give up to get that revenue, whether it's paying off the state through some revenue sharing, bullshit revenue sharing agreement, or whether it's giving up jurisdiction to policing in there, or whether it's taxes being taken out of winnings, or whether it's using a New York State liquor license for the booze that you're selling inside a casino. I mean, look, the lines that get crossed get crazy, and that's the nation doing this stuff. So where does that leave the rest of us? So when I talk about the identity conflicts that we have, complexes that we have, much of it goes back to some of these very things. Not understanding the role that we play within our territory, the role that we play within our nations, the role that we play as individuals, and the responsibility, not just the rights, but the responsibility. See, part of the whole issue always comes down to, yes, it's fine to say that sovereignty is vested in the individual. Well, responsibility comes with that. Not just the opportunity to sell cigarettes. I mean, there's a responsibility, because we all should be cognizant, whether it's the nation getting a New York State liquor license, or giving up waiving certain sovereign immunities, or whether it's individuals who get involved in some things that that could challenge the whole notion of sovereignty. Now, like I said, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out with this legalization of marijuana. And look, I'm not discouraging it. I by all means, I think people should just do it. And in just the same way that we got involved in the sale of tobacco, because I think New York State would be hard pressed to come after anybody on Seneca territory or any of our native territories here who is deciding to get into, even if it's what do they call it, parallel or vertical integration. So you're growing, you're processing, and you're selling, and they're trying to stop big companies from doing that kind of stuff with this new law, I guess. But why should state laws impact what happens here on native territory? I mean, let's face it, state laws haven't been particularly effective, in spite of all the people they've locked up over trying to prohibit marijuana use anyway. I mean, even in federal law hasn't been very particularly useful. The biggest thing that they did is they have been effective at trying to, at keeping this stuff kind of what I would call black market, I guess, by prohibiting banking or insurances and that kind of stuff. One of the biggest obstacles that even in states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use, there has been a challenge about the financial institutions and how much they could be utilized as a part of advancing these businesses. And we're always going to be wary of that. I'm not saying we don't use banks. Yes, we have credit card, we have merchant accounts for credit card processing and any number of things, but we always have a bit of a challenge with how much we are integrated into the rest of the banking commerce stream, so to speak. And so that's gonna be a challenge. But I think part of that challenge comes down to, do any of the nations, not just Seneca Nation, but do any of the nations have the authority to prohibit somebody from doing something? And if they claim they do, where did they get that authority? Because I'm not talking about getting it from the state. I'm not talking about getting it from the federal government. I'm saying where, in what context and in what event, in what referendum, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I'm not a big fan of those either, but in what context can a nation government, a native government, claim that they have the authority to assert will over their people? Especially when you consider what our origins are and where we come from in this lack of hierarchy. Now, we could debate even within the system of the Guyana-Goa that there would be, meetings and the clans would meet and, it would, you'd go back and forth across, with the conversation and you would come to a consensus. But that's not the way things work. Even in many of the elections, even the referendum processes don't necessarily work that well. Just ask the folks who still think Trump should be president. So these are the challenges, and they are pretty vast. But I think we do have to understand at its core that we are a distinct people, and for a judge or an elected tribal councilor or a so-called traditional chief, whoever they are, if they are violating not just the two-row wampum, but if they are violating the Guyana-Goa, if they are taking authority that they don't justly have, that's a problem. And it's been happening. And granted, now if you no longer operate under Guyana-Goa, and not very many places do, quite frankly, but even many of the constitutional governments, not necessarily IRA, Indian Reorganization Act governments, but even like Seneca Nation with their constitution, there's nothing in that constitution that is intended to violate Guyana-Goa, but they create different responsibilities. But that's not the same thing as saying it grants, any kind of exclusive or, general authority over other people. Almost every position that is laid out in the Seneca Nation Constitution comes with a responsibility, not with an authority. That's, and that's what most people have lost sight of. We don't have hierarchies. And even many of these written constitutions, again, they talk about responsibilities. Look, in the Guyana-Goa, there are positions that have responsibilities, but not authority. Clan mothers, chiefs, for lack of better words. I mean, war chief. I mean, there are different people. Faith keeper, sub chiefs, all these things that have now become incorporated in these concepts. They're all about responsibilities. None of them are about authority. They're about how you gather the will of the people. Well, that is what gets complicated here, because it's not just about gathering the will of the people, but again, I go back to what I said in the beginning. The sovereignty is what we're born with. It's a birthright. We all possess it. We all have that responsibility to carry ourselves. So anytime that we're going to let somebody else speak on our behalf, it has to be very explicit what authority they've been given to speak on our behalf. And again, I'm talking about authority to speak, not authority to wield in terms of power. This is one of the more complicated issues, but it really does come down to understanding that we are not monarchies. Chiefs are not monarchs. We're not democracies. Even with the Constitution that the Seneca Nation has, that's not constitutional authority. Most of that is constitutional responsibility, and there's a difference. At our core, when we go back to who we are as a people, at our core, we reject the notion that any head is higher than the other, and that's something that we have to re-embrace and understand what that means in terms of how we conduct ourselves and how we organize. Look, anarchy is not the absence of organization, at least not in the sense that I'm talking about indigenous anarchy. It's about the lack of hierarchy. It is not the lack of responsibility. It's just the lack of hierarchy. So anyway, that's I wanted to cover this here, and look, I'll get more into some of the details of some of these cases as I go through them. But I wanted to bring this up because I think this is a relevant point. So I want to thank you for listening. I am John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.